Apache woman joked she'd be his if the cowboy found the ring she lost. Her shock when he did. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from.
The day was fading by the time Adam Mercer rode across the open flats that bordered Red Valley. The sun had begun to settle behind the rocky ridge, and the dimming lights spread across the land in long, level bands that softened the edges of every fence post and scrub bush. Adam's horse moved with a steady, worn-out gait, its hooves stirring up loose soil that drifted behind them in quiet trails. Adam had spent the afternoon at the trading post picking up wire, lamp oil, and a new rasp for the horse's hooves. He traveled alone most days, and he preferred returning home before dark to shut the chickens in, check the gates, and lock the barn. Routine grounded him. Predictability gave him structure he no longer found in people. He was a man who had lived through events that carved the noise out of him. Years earlier, he had lost both his brother and his place in a nearby town after a violent dispute he never fully explained to anyone. Since then, he had kept to himself on a patch of dry land where no one expected conversation. His mission in life had become simple: maintain the ranch well enough that it didn't fall apart and keep his distance from problems that didn't belong to him. As he approached the yard, Adam noticed movement near the water trough. A woman knelt in the dirt with her palms pressed to the ground, sifting through the packed soil with careful, tense strokes. Her long black hair hung loose, and dust clung to the ends. The dress she wore was marked with beadwork and fringe, the kind used for travel rather than ceremony. She didn't seem injured, but her posture showed exhaustion, the kind that came from days of walking while trying to remain alert. Adam stopped a short distance away, allowing the horse to settle. He watched her movements in silence, trying to understand what she was looking for and whether she posed any threat. He had seen people approach ranches out of desperation before, some seeking food, others shelter, a few trouble. This woman didn't fit any pattern he knew. She wasn't begging or hiding. She was concentrating so intensely he wondered if she even noticed him. When she finally lifted her head, her eyes met his with a guarded steadiness. She didn't scramble to her feet. She didn't reach for a weapon. She simply breathed with the controlled rhythm of someone who had learned not to show fear, even when she felt it burn under her ribs. Her voice was low and dry when she said she had lost a ring. She added, with a strained attempt at humor, that any man who found it would earn her as a wife. The joke landed awkwardly, almost like a shield she used to hide panic. The comment didn't amuse Adam, but it didn't unsettle him either. He understood the tone people used when they tried to pretend their situation wasn't as bad as it felt. Instead of answering, he loosened the reins, stepped down from the saddle, and walked toward her. His boots pressed into the dirt with steady weight as he crouched beside her, without crowding her space. Her eyes flicked to his hands, waiting to see what he intended. Adam didn't touch her or interrogate her. He rested his fingers on the ground and began moving the loose dirt aside with slow, deliberate motions. He had no particular reason to help her except that her voice carried a tightness he recognized from years of carrying his own losses. Nayeli studied him in return. Her thoughts raced behind her controlled expression. She wondered if he expected payment, if he saw opportunity, or if he was deciding whether she was worth trouble. She had left a hostile camp 2 days earlier after tensions turned dangerous. She had food for only one more evening, and she did not know this territory's tribes or ranchers well enough to guess who might welcome or harm her. The ring she was searching for belonged to her mother. It was the last thing she carried from a life she had lost long before she chose to leave the camp. Losing it in the dust felt like losing the last thread that connected her to anyone she once trusted. Adam worked without speaking, brushing aside small clumps of soil and bits of gravel. His mind stayed focused, but he was also listening to her breathing, to the shift of her weight, to the faint edge of fear she was trying to hide. After several minutes, his fingertips hit something cool beneath the surface. He pinched the small object and lifted it from the dirt, revealing the thin silver band. The moment she saw it, her body stiffened. Her chest tightened as if someone had knocked the air out of her. Adam didn't hand it to her quickly. He held it out with an open palm at a distance that required no step forward. She reached slowly, her hand shaking once before she steadied it. Her fingers closed around the ring, and she lowered her gaze, focusing on it as if confirming it was real. Adam rose in a careful, unhurried motion. He pointed toward the trough, offering water without using his voice. She hesitated, not because she didn't want it, but because she had learned to expect conditions for every kindness. When he stepped back to give her room, the hesitation eased. She cupped water in her hands and drank in small measured sips. The coldness soothed her throat, which still burned from traveling without enough rest. He gathered a few pieces of wood from a nearby pile and returned to the central clearing of the yard. She watched him as she dried her hands on her skirt. He struck flint against kindling and built a modest fire. He didn't tell her to sit. He didn't ask for anything in return. Adam had no intention of turning anyone away into the night unless they gave him a reason to. Nayeli weighed her options in silence. She was tired enough that her legs trembled when she shifted her stance. She knew the land grew colder after sundown, and sleeping without fire meant waking stiff and weak. But staying near a stranger carried its own dangers. She watched his posture, the way he sat a short distance from the flames, shoulders slightly hunched as if he always prepared for confrontation but never invited it. He didn't stare at her or wait for her reaction. His stillness, oddly, felt safer than forced hospitality. She stepped toward the fire and lowered herself onto the ground near its outer edge. The warmth reached her slowly, loosening the tightness in her back. She kept her hands folded in her lap, fingers brushing over the ring to reassure herself it hadn't disappeared again. Adam tore a strip of dried meat and set it near her. She glanced at him, trying to read whether he expected conversation. He didn't. He watched the flames with a calm focus, his thoughts drifting to the quiet he had built for himself. He wondered how long she had been walking. He wondered what had pushed her to risk crossing land alone. For the first time in days, Nayeli's breathing slowed. She remained alert, but the fear that clung to her since leaving the camp began to loosen its grip. The fire burned steadily between them, and the silence they shared was neither strained nor uncomfortable. She had met men who filled every spare moment with talk, trying to assert control. Adam did the opposite. He allowed space for decisions to be made without pressure. As the sky turned from orange to deep blue, the last of the warmth faded from the ridge. Coyotes cried somewhere beyond the property line, their voices thin in the wide dark. Adam added another log to the fire. Nayeli shifted slightly closer, not enough to signal trust, but enough to show she wasn't preparing to run. They did not speak again. They didn't need to. Both understood how rare it was to sit near a stranger and feel less threatened than alone. By the time night settled fully over the flats, one truth had already formed for both of them. Their presence beside the fire was not an accident or a moment of convenience. It was the first step towards something neither had expected to find. Morning arrived without warning. The darkness outside the ranch thinned gradually until faint gray light pressed through the cracks between the cabin boards. Adam stepped out first, rubbing stiffness from his hands as the cold air settled across his shoulders. He scanned the yard out of habit, checking the fence lines, the henhouse door, and the trough water level. Everything was in place. Nothing moved except the slow drift of dust from the night breeze. Nayeli sat near the remnants of the fire, her legs folded beneath her, her back straight despite the long hours she had spent seated on the ground. She hadn't slept much. Her eyes carried a faint redness that came from keeping herself alert. It wasn't mistrust of Adam that held her awake. It was the years of experience that taught her sleeping deeply around strangers could be fatal. When she noticed him watching, she lifted her chin slightly, not defensive, just acknowledging his presence. Adam crouched beside the fire ring and nudged the ashes with a branch. The smell of cooled embers rose faintly. He set a small iron pot on the stove inside the cabin, then returned with 2 tin plates. He placed bread and beans on each without ceremony and set one at her side. She hesitated only a moment before taking it. Hunger outweighed caution. As she ate, Adam studied her more closely. He noticed the bruising along her forearm, the scuff marks on her knees, the dirt embedded in the seam of her dress from long travel. She kept her movements quiet and controlled, as if every gesture had to be weighed before she allowed it. He wondered how far she had walked. He wondered what kind of trouble forced her to do it alone. When he finally asked for her name, she paused mid-bite. Her gaze lowered to the ground as she swallowed, working through the decision of whether to answer. Offering a name meant allowing a piece of herself to be known, and she had spent years protecting those pieces. After a few seconds, she spoke clearly. Nayeli. Adam nodded once in acknowledgement. He gave his own name only after she looked at him again, making sure she wanted it. Adam Mercer. There was no handshake, no explanation, just an exchange of simple truths. After the meal, he rose and walked toward the barn. Nayeli followed at a distance, observing how he moved with deliberate steadiness rather than haste. The barn smelled of dry hay and old wood. Dust hung in the beams of morning light that filtered through the gaps. Adam examined the stall hinges, tightening a screw here, straightening a bent nail there. Nayeli watched with interest, not because the work was unusual, but because she hadn't stood inside a place that felt stable for months. She reached out to touch one of the saddle straps he had repaired earlier. The leather was smooth but worn, the stitching precise. When Adam noticed her examining it, he didn't interrupt. Instead, he opened a chest of tools and handed her a small cloth to wipe away dust. The gesture was practical, not patronizing. She accepted it without comment. While they worked, her thoughts drifted back to the camp she had left behind. Tensions had worsened when a dispute over leadership turned violent. She had no family there, no allies willing to intervene. So leaving was the only option she believed would keep her alive. She didn't tell Adam any of this. She wasn't ready to offer those pieces of her story. But the weight of that decision still sat heavily on her shoulders. Outside the barn, the wind picked up slightly, pushing loose dirt across the yard. Adam led the horse to the trough and checked its hooves. Nayeli stepped back so the animal wouldn't feel crowded. She understood horses well enough to know when not to interfere. "Where are you headed?" Adam asked, his voice low and even. She took her time answering, unsure of how much to reveal. "I don't know," she finally said. "Just away from where I was." He accepted the answer without pressing. She appreciated that more than she expected. Most men demanded clarity or tried to impose their own plans onto her situation. Adam didn't either. He simply acknowledged her words with a small movement of his head and continued brushing the horse. Once the chores were done, he walked the boundary fence to check for loose rails. He didn't ask her to join him, but she followed anyway. The land stretched wide in every direction: dry soil, scattered sagebrush, a distant ridge shaped by wind. She studied the landscape with cautious interest. Traveling alone meant constantly scanning the environment for threats, entrances, and escape routes. Old habit made her evaluate every angle. Walking beside him gave her a strange sense of relief she didn't want to admit. His quiet presence was unlike the chaotic energy she had endured in the camp. He had no intention of controlling her steps. He simply continued at a pace steady enough for her to match. When they reached the far corner of the fence, a broken post leaned toward the ground. Adam knelt to examine it. Nayeli crouched beside him, her fingers tracing a fresh crack in the wood. "It happened last night," she said softly. Wind was strong. Adam glanced at her, surprised she had observed that detail. He tightened the wire while she held the post upright. Their cooperation required no instruction. They worked as if they had done this before, though it was the first task they had shared. As they finished, her gaze drifted to the ring tied securely in the leather cord around her neck. She placed her hand over it, steadying her breath. The relief of having it back had settled deeper overnight. She had lost nearly everything in her life, but this one small object, held a memory she refused to release. Adam didn't ask about the ring, but he noticed the way she guarded it. He also noticed the shift in her posture after they completed the repair. She stood taller, as if participating in the work anchored her to the ground in a way that had been missing for too long. Back at the yard, She watched him sort tools into the crate by the porch. She realized she had been waiting for him to tell her to leave. When he didn't, confusion mixed with caution. Most men wanted something definite in exchange for food and safety. Adam's lack of demands unsettled her more than a threat would have. Finally, she asked, "Do you want me gone?" Adam paused, holding a coil of rope. "Not unless you're planning to harm me or my stock." She held his gaze, trying to read any hidden meaning. She found none. Nayeli didn't thank him. Gratitude felt too vulnerable, too exposing. Instead, she sat on the porch step, letting the quiet settle again. She listened to the distant sound of a hawk circling overhead and the soft clatter of tools as Adam closed the crate. The morning had shifted something subtle between them. Not trust, not yet, but a small understanding that neither sought to exploit the other. For the first time since leaving the camp, Nayeli felt her chest expand with a slow breath that didn't hurt. It wasn't safety, not entirely, but it was the closest she had been to it in longer than she could remember. The afternoon settled into a still, dry quiet that stretched across the yard as Adam arranged a stack of scrap lumber outside the barn. The sun hovered at a sharp angle, bright enough to sting the eyes, but softened by a faint haze drifting in from the west. The temperature rose just enough to pull the scent of warm soil into the air. Adam wiped his palms on his trousers and shifted the boards into an organized pile, working with the steady focus of someone who preferred tasks that required his hands rather than his voice. Nayeli stood near the corner of the cabin, her back against the log wall, holding the leather cord that carried her mother's ring. For the first time since arriving, she allowed herself to really look at the ranch, its modest layout, its worn structures, its sense of function over comfort. The place wasn't beautiful, but it felt honest. She tracked every sound: the creak of the barn door, the soft breath of the horse inside, the scraping of Adam's boots against the ground. Her instincts had not yet relaxed, but the tension that usually sat at the base of her neck had loosened to a small degree. She stepped away from the shadow of the cabin and approached the well. As she pulled the rope to draw fresh water, the thin cords in her arms tightened from the effort. Her body still carried fatigue from the days spent traveling, but she hid it as best she could. When the bucket reached the surface, she steadied it on the stone rim and dipped her hands into the cold water. The shock of the temperature made her inhale sharply. It felt grounding. Adam noticed her from across the yard. He didn't approach immediately. He watched the careful way she adjusted her stance, the way she lowered her shoulders after the first sip, the way she scanned the tree line before turning her back to anything. He recognized that kind of vigilance. It was the habit of someone who had lived too long with danger just out of sight. When he finally walked toward her, his steps were deliberate. He carried a cloth and a small tin of salve he kept for scrapes and cuts. He didn't assume she would accept it, so he held it out without stepping too close. "You've got a split on your hand," he said quietly, nodding toward the raw line across her knuckle. She glanced at it, surprised she hadn't noticed the injury earlier. The skin had broken from digging through the hardened dirt the day before. She hesitated, unsure what allowing help from him meant, then extended her hand just enough for him to apply the salve. His touch was brief, careful, and never lingered. When he stepped back, she felt an unexpected thread of relief run through her chest. "Thank you," she said, the words steady but controlled. Adam gave a small nod, the kind he used when acknowledgement was enough. She returned to the porch and sat on the lower step, keeping her knees close and her eyes on the ring. The leather cord lay across her palm like a line connecting her past to her present. After several quiet minutes, she spoke without looking at him. "My mother wore this until the day she died." He didn't respond. He let the silence show that he was listening, not demanding. "She told me to keep it because it was the only thing nobody ever managed to take from her." Her jaw tightened. Last night in the camp, they tried. Adam crouched beside the porch, his hands resting on his thighs. He didn't ask for details. He didn't try to offer comfort she wasn't asking for. He simply stayed close enough that she knew the story wouldn't fall into empty space. She continued, speaking slowly, as if choosing each word with caution. "There was a man who wanted me to stay under his rule. Said I owed him loyalty because he fed me when I had nothing. People like him don't understand loyalty. They just want control. Her eyes hardened. When I refused him, everything shifted. People I knew stopped looking at me as a person. Just something troublesome. Adam absorbed her words with a seriousness that didn't waver. He had seen men like the one she described. Men who thrived on authority they never earned. Men who twisted gratitude into obedience. So I left, she said. I didn't wait to see what they planned next. She finally lifted her gaze to him. For a moment, he saw the conflict behind her expression. Fear mixed with anger. Exhaustion tied to stubborn resolve. Losing this ring, she continued, closing her fingers around it, felt like losing the last thing that was mine because I chose it, not because someone allowed it. Adam straightened slowly, the sun casting a sharp shadow behind him. You won't lose it here, he said, the words plain but solid. She absorbed the statement in silence, weighing whether to believe it. Trust didn't come easily, but something about his tone, steady, unforced, made her chest loosen again. When she rose from the porch, she moved with more stability. Adam handed her a coil of rope and gestured toward a weak fence section on the south edge of the property. She followed him, and together they inspected the sagging rail. She held the post upright while he reinforced it with fresh wire. Their coordination felt almost natural. Nayeli noticed how he checked her grip before tightening the line, making sure she wasn't straining. No one had done that for her in years. While they worked, she asked, "Why stay out here alone?" Adam didn't lift his eyes from the wire. Easier than dealing with people who bring their trouble to your door. Is that why you left where you lived before? He paused. Not long, but enough to show the question touched something he rarely spoke about. I had a brother, he said. Town didn't feel right after things fell apart. So I came here. Haven't had reason to leave since. She understood the unspoken parts. Losing someone changed the shape of a life. Isolation wasn't always chosen. It was sometimes the only thing that kept a person steady. When the fence was fixed, they walked back toward the house. The air had cooled, carrying the distant cry of a hawk circling above the ridge. Nayeli looked over the property, seeing it differently now. It wasn't a place of luxury or ease, but it wasn't dangerous. It wasn't loud. It wasn't full of shifting alliances. It was simply a place where each hour passed without someone trying to control her. She let out a slow, quiet breath. Adam opened the barn door to store the tools. He looked at her once, not questioning, not expecting anything. Nayeli didn't smile, but she allowed her features to soften. She sat on the porch again, letting the late-day warmth settle over her shoulders. For the first time since leaving the camp, she didn't outline an escape route in her head. For the first time in a long time, the silence around her didn't feel like a threat. The next morning broke with a colder breeze rolling down from the northern hills. The light arrived slowly, spreading through the valley in pale streaks that revealed every uneven line of the landscape. Adam stepped outside with a coil of rope slung over one shoulder and a worn leather canteen at his hip. He needed to check the ridge road behind the property, a stretch of narrow trail often damaged by storms and stray cattle. It was part of his routine every few days, a preventive measure that kept his gates from being forced open by wandering livestock. Nayeli stood by the barn when he approached, brushing dust from her dress and tightening the leather cord that held her ring. She looked more rested, though faint shadows still lingered beneath her eyes. When she noticed the rope and canteen, she straightened with quiet alertness, unsure if she was needed or merely observing. "I'm heading up the ridge," Adam said, adjusting the strap on his shoulder. "It's rough terrain. Check it often so nothing collapses." She nodded. Her instinct was to stay close enough to understand her surroundings, but not close enough to appear dependent. Before she could decide whether to follow, Adam slowed his pace and looked back over his shoulder. "You can walk with me if you want," he said simply. It wasn't an order. It wasn't a request packed with hidden intent. It was an open door. She joined him without a word. They left the yard and followed a narrow path that curved around a cluster of mesquite trees. The ground rose gradually, the soil thinning into patches of exposed rock. The ridge stood higher than the surrounding land, giving a wide view of the valley and the distant settlement barely visible beyond the stretch of open plain. The higher they climbed, the stronger the wind became, tugging lightly at Naeli's hair as she steadied herself on the uneven trail. Adam walked a few steps ahead, choosing a pace that didn't rush her. He didn't comment on her caution, though he noticed how her eyes tracked every movement: hawk shadows, shifting branches, drifting dust. She was reading the landscape with the skill of someone who had lived too often in places where danger arrived without warning. Halfway up the ridge, they stopped near a crooked cottonwood tree growing at an angle from the rocky slope. Adam knelt beside a deep crack along the trail's edge. Overnight erosion had widened it, threatening to break the narrow path if left unreinforced. "This part slips every few months," he muttered, pressing his hand against the unstable dirt. "Need support." Naeli crouched opposite him, examining the loosened soil. She pressed her fingers into the dirt, testing its firmness. "If the next rain comes hard, this will drop," she said. "You'll lose the trail." Adam's eyes flicked to her, surprised by her assessment. She explained that she had spent years traveling uneven terrain, crossing plateaus, moving between camps, finding safer ground for shelter. She learned what slopes held and which ones gave way without warning. He listened, recognizing experience, not guesswork. "Help me brace it," he said. He cut long wooden stakes from a nearby fallen branch and handed one to her. Together, they drove them into the slope at opposite angles, forming a crude support that held the soil in place. The work required strength and balance. At one point, the dirt shifted under Naeli's foot. She swayed, instinctively reaching for the rock beside her. Adam extended a hand, not grabbing, just offering stability. She steadied herself but did not take the hand. Instead, she nodded once, acknowledging the gesture, then continued working. By the time they finished reinforcing the trail, the wind had settled, leaving a stillness that carried only the sounds of their breathing and the distant rustle of brush. They sat briefly on the flat stone overlooking the valley. From this height, the world looked wider than Naeli remembered. She scanned the horizon, searching for movement or signs of pursuit, but saw nothing except the slow drift of dust rising from the plains. "You expecting someone to follow you?" Adam asked, not accusing, only assessing. "No," she answered softly. "But people don't always let go of what they think they own." Her voice held a weight that didn't demand sympathy. She wasn't trying to evoke a response. She was stating a truth learned through experience. Adam looked back at the ridge road. "You're not owned here," he said. The statement wasn't dramatic. It wasn't meant to comfort. It was a straightforward fact he intended to keep true. When they descended the ridge, Naeli walked a bit closer than before. Not beside him, but near enough that the space between them no longer felt as defensive as it had the previous day. She watched the way he moved, how he avoided stepping on loose stones that might roll underfoot, how he scanned the lower trail for any new tracks. His cautious habits matched hers, though for different reasons. At the base of the hill, they stopped to rest near a small patch of shade. Adam offered her the canteen. She hesitated, then took it, letting the water ease the dryness in her throat. She handed it back without touching his fingers. As they continued toward the ranch, Naeli asked her first question since joining him on the trail. "Why do you keep this place so far from town?" "Quieter here," Adam said. "People in town watch each other too closely. Too many expectations, too much gossip." She considered this. She understood the desire to separate oneself from noise and judgment. "And the ranch?" she asked. "Why stay instead of moving somewhere new?" Adam looked straight ahead. "Because this land doesn't ask anything from me." She absorbed that answer with a faint tightening of her jaw. It was the first time she felt an echo of her own motivations reflected in someone else's words. When they reached the yard again, the sun had risen higher, warming the ground beneath their boots. Naeli paused before walking toward the porch, studying the cabin and the open space around it. The land felt less foreign now, not familiar, but less hostile. A place where time didn't threaten to collapse on her. Adam took the rope from his shoulder and set it beside the tool crate. He didn't look at her directly, but his posture signaled that he accepted her presence without uncertainty. Nayeli touched the ring at her chest, feeling the cool metal beneath her fingertips. For the first time since she fled the camp, she realized she hadn't thought about where she might run next. Even more surprising, she didn't feel the urge to. Late morning settled over the ranch with a heat that rose steadily from the ground. The sky widened into a clear, hard blue, the kind that gave no sign of rain or relief. Adam finished tightening a loose hinge on the barn door, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of his hand. Nayeli stood near the porch post, braiding a small section of her hair with focused fingers. It was the closest she came to relaxation, though she kept her body angled so she could see both the road and the yard. She had been quieter than usual since their return from the ridge. Not withdrawn, but deep in thought. Adam didn't press her. He carried a bucket to the trough and tipped it slowly, watching the water settle. He was about to walk toward the tool crate when a distant sound cut through the stillness, a sharp rhythm carried by the breeze. Hoofbeats, not casual riding, someone pushing their horse at a determined pace. Nayeli froze. Her hands tightened around the braid until her knuckles whitened. Her jaw shifted, a small, controlled movement that signaled tension she fought to hide. She didn't step backward or reach for a weapon. She simply braced herself, preparing for whatever appeared over the rise. Adam moved toward the porch but didn't rush. He set himself in a position where he could stand between Nayeli and whoever approached, without making the gesture obvious. His demeanor remained even, but his posture changed, more solid, more grounded, ready to read trouble before it hit the yard. A rider crested the small hill to the south, dust kicking up behind the horse's uneven strides. The man slowed as he neared the ranch, studying the property with a sharpness that suggested he was looking for someone specific. His coat was patched, his boots scuffed, his hat pulled low over his brow. The look he carried wasn't curiosity, it was calculation. The horse stopped a few yards from the trough. The rider swept his gaze across the yard, his eyes pausing briefly on the tracks near the fence, then on the porch where Nayeli stood partly behind Adam. "You seen an Apache woman pass through here?" the rider asked, voice dry and edged with suspicion. Adam didn't shift his weight. His answer came steady and without hesitation. "No one's come through except me." The rider's attention sharpened. "You sure about that?" Adam kept his stance relaxed but immovable. "I don't mistake what I see on my own land." The man's gaze flicked to Nayeli again, this time with lingering interest. Not curiosity, ownership. The kind of stare that marked someone who believed other people's lives could be handled like property. Nayeli didn't flinch, but her fingers curled against the porch rail as she fought the instinct to run. Adam took a half step forward, not aggressive, but unmistakably intent. The message was clear. The rider would address him, not her. "You're covering for someone," the rider said. "I'm telling you what's true," Adam replied. "Now state your business or move on." The horse shifted under the man's weight, unsettled by the tension in the air. The rider scowled, then spat into the dirt. "If she shows herself, you'll regret lying." Adam didn't blink. "I'm not in the habit of letting strangers threaten me on my property." For a long moment, no one moved. Then, perhaps sensing that Adam was not a man who could be intimidated with vague warnings, the rider jerked the reins and turned the horse sharply. Dust sprayed upward as the animal carried him back down the road. Only when the rider disappeared behind the hill did Nayeli release the breath she'd been holding. She pressed her hand to her ribs, as if steadying an internal tremor. Adam watched her quietly, noting the way her shoulders trembled before she forced them still. "He knows the camp I left," she said, her voice tight. "Men like him don't let things go." Adam leaned one hand against the porch post, anchoring himself before answering. "He's not getting anything here." Nayeli looked at him with a mixture of disbelief and confusion. "You don't even know why he's after me." "I don't need the story to understand danger," he replied. "And I don't hand people over because someone speaks loudly." Her breath hitched, not with fear this time, but with something closer to uncertainty about how to receive that kind of support. She wasn't used to someone standing in front of her without demanding details or repayment. She turned away briefly, regaining control before facing him again. If he returns with others, I don't want you dragged into trouble. That's not your burden, Adam said. It becomes yours if I stay, she countered. He didn't retreat from her logic. He didn't argue. He simply considered it, then answered with quiet firmness. I've dealt with worse than a man who talks too much. The truth in his tone reached her before the words did. Something in her posture loosened, just a fraction, but real. As the sun climbed higher, Adam returned to his chores. Nayeli joined him without being asked. She carried smaller pieces of firewood to the shed while he split larger logs. Each swing of the axe landed with a dull thud that echoed across the yard. She stole glances at him from time to time, trying to understand why a man with no obligation to her had placed himself between her and danger so easily. Adam didn't look back, but he felt the shift between them. The beginning of trust, faint but unmistakable. By midday, the earlier tension still lingered, but it no longer suffocated the air. Something else had taken root, a quiet understanding that neither of them addressed aloud. It didn't need words. The choice Adam made when that rider appeared had already spoken for him. A cooler wind drifted over the ranch the following morning, carrying the faint scent of sage from the western flats. The ground held the chill from a night as Adam stepped outside with a bundle of worn gear under his arm. He needed to sort through the equipment before winter crept in. Straps to mend, tools to oil, harnesses to inspect. It was the kind of work he usually preferred doing alone, partly out of habit, partly because it let him keep his mind steady. Nayeli sat on the porch steps, pulling loose threads from her dress and tightening a frayed seam with controlled, precise movements. She had slept lightly again, but her eyes seemed clearer today, less burdened by the fear that had shadowed her since the rider appeared. She looked toward the barn, tracking Adam's steps as though trying to understand the rhythm of his routine. When he set the bundle of gear on a flat board near the fence, Nayeli approached without prompting. She didn't ask to help. She simply knelt beside the pile, lifted a cracked leather strap, and examined the tier with a practiced eye. Adam watched her for a moment, surprised by the skill in her hands. She threaded a needle through thick sinew, tightening the torn edge with firm, even stitches. "You've done this before," Adam said. She nodded once, adjusting the strap between her fingers. "Travel teaches you to keep your belongings from falling apart. You fix things, or you lose them." Her tone carried no complaint, just fact. Adam oiled the metal buckles while she reinforced the stitching. They worked quietly, the only sounds the scrape of the needle through leather and the dull clack of buckles dropping onto the wood. Their silence held no tension. It was a shared stillness that filled the space between them with a strange sense of order. After a while, Nayeli paused and looked toward the open plain behind the barn. "He might come back," she said, referring to yesterday's rider. "Men like that don't stop after one attempt." Adam didn't look up from the harness he was cleaning. "If he does, I'll deal with it." "You're not responsible for what follows me," she insisted. "That's not how I see it," he replied, voice even. "Someone rode onto my land and thought he could make demands here. That's the issue, not you." Her jaw tightened at the distinction. It wasn't how she was used to being addressed. Most people lumped her presence and her problems together as if she embodied the threat itself. "What if there are more?" she asked. "Then I'll handle more," Adam said. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't speak with bravado. He delivered the words with a calm certainty grounded in experience. Nayeli lowered her eyes to the strap again, her fingers moving slower now. She wasn't convinced the danger had passed, but she felt something unexpected under her ribs, relief mixed with unfamiliar doubt. She had spent so long anticipating betrayal that a simple act of protection felt almost unreal. By midday, they moved to the shaded side of the barn to continue repairing gear. Adam laid out a set of old bridle pieces, some cracked, others misshapen. Nayeli sorted them into a neat line, grouping them by thickness and function. Her organizational sense caught him off guard. "You were responsible for equipment in your camp," he observed. "Sometimes," she said, "people trusted me with things more easily than they trusted me with decisions." Her tone was controlled, but the meaning behind it was sharp enough to make Adam glance at her. She didn't elaborate. She just picked up the next piece and began tightening the stitching. A strong gust of wind blew through the yard, lifting dust and swirling it around their feet. Adam anchored the board with his boot so the smaller tools wouldn't scatter. Nayeli raised her arm to shield her eyes, then let it fall once the wind eased. "Storm season's coming early," Adam said. Nayeli nodded, aware that bad weather meant more risk for anyone traveling alone. She thought about the distance she had already covered, the places she'd slept, the cold nights ahead. A part of her wondered if she should start planning her departure before the sky turned violent and the trails grew treacherous. Almost as if sensing the thought forming, Adam said, "You don't need to rush anywhere." She didn't answer immediately. "I don't want to stay so long that trouble finds you." "That's my concern," he replied. "Not yours." His words carried no pressure. They were simply clear. Nayeli finished stitching the strap and set it aside. She wiped her hands on a cloth Adam handed her, then looked around the yard with a slow, thoughtful sweep of her gaze. She noticed the cracked stones near the trough, the worn edges of the porch steps, the weathered posts lining the corral. It was a place shaped by quiet perseverance, held together by one man's steady labor. It wasn't a home in the way she once understood the word, but it wasn't hostile either. Adam handed her another strap, but she didn't take it right away. "If I stay longer," she said carefully, "I want it to be because I'm helping, not because I'm a burden you won't speak about." He studied her expression. "You haven't caused me any trouble." "I'm not talking about trouble," she said. Her voice softened. "I mean wait." Adam looked at the tools in his hands, choosing his response with care. "Work goes easier with another set of hands. That's all." Her eyes lowered, absorbing the meaning with a quiet exhale. She had rarely been spoken to that way, neither pitted nor dismissed. They spent the rest of the afternoon repairing gear, sorting tools, and checking the barn's outer beams. Adam noticed how she learned his routine quickly, anticipating which tool he'd need next, moving out of the way when the space tightened, stepping forward when the task required cooperation. She had a natural sense of rhythm with work, something he hadn't experienced alongside another person in years. When the sun dipped behind the ridge, painting the yard in muted orange, Nayeli gathered the repaired pieces and placed them neatly inside the barn. Adam secured the door, sliding the heavy latch into place. There was a brief moment where both simply stood in the shadowed doorway, neither rushing to speak. "You did good work," Adam said. Nayeli tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, unsure how to receive praise that carried no ulterior motive. "It felt steady," she admitted quietly. "Steady's not a bad thing," he replied. As they walked back toward the cabin, the air settled into a softer chill. The day's tension had thinned, replaced by a faint sense of cooperation that felt new but not unwelcome. For the first time since she arrived, Nayeli didn't wonder where she might sleep tomorrow. She wondered what work they might finish together instead. By the time evening settled over the valley, the sky had shifted into a dense, low ceiling of clouds that moved with unusual speed. The air felt heavier, charged with the unmistakable scent of incoming rain. Adam stepped out onto the porch with a lantern, scanning the horizon for lightning. He didn't see any flashes, but the wind carried a thickness that promised a storm before midnight. Nayeli stood near the corner of the fence, arms folded against a sudden drop in temperature. A faint shiver ran along her spine, though she hid it as best she could. Storms didn't frighten her, but they reminded her of too many nights spent outside with no shelter, her survival depending on keeping a fire alive through wind strong enough to erase tracks and scent. Adam moved past her without speaking, heading toward the barn. "Need to get the doors tied shut," he said. "This wind'll rip the hinges off." She followed, not asking for directions. Together they pulled the heavy wooden doors closed while wind pushed against them in sudden bursts. Adam looped thick rope through the metal rings and secured the knots with firm, practiced pulls. Nayeli braced her shoulder against the door to help him force it tight enough to withstand the coming storm. "Good," Adam said, testing the tension. "Should hold." A cold drizzle began, soft at first, then increasingly consistent. Tiny droplets clung to Naeli's hair and eyelashes, making her blink several times to clear her vision. Adam lit the lantern and guided them toward the cabin, the mud already softening beneath their boots. Inside, the single window clattered from the wind. Adam slid the wooden bar across the frame to keep it steady. Naeli remained near the stove, rubbing her arms as the sound of rain intensified. He knelt beside the fire pit and rebuilt the flames from fresh kindling, the crackling warmth gradually pushing back the chill. She lowered herself onto the floor beside the wall, her knees pulled toward her chest. The firelight reflected off the ring she held loosely in her palm, and for a moment her eyes softened, not from sadness, but from the weight of memories she seldom allowed herself to revisit. Adam noticed, but he didn't comment. He placed another log into the stove and sat down a careful distance from her. His presence wasn't intrusive. It was steady, something she found herself relying on more than she expected. The rain picked up, drumming against the roof in fast, uneven rhythms. Wind pressed against the cabin walls, causing the lantern flame to sway. Naeli glanced at the door once, then at Adam. "You're used to storms like this," she said. "Spent years patching leaks and tightening things down," he replied. "Eventually you learn the weak points." She nodded slowly. "Storms don't bother me. It's what comes after that made me wary." Adam looked at her with quiet understanding. "Nothing out there tonight," he said. "Nobody looking to cause trouble in weather like this." The reassurance wasn't patronizing. It was practical, grounded in truth. She accepted it with a small, almost imperceptible breath. A louder gust hit the cabin, and she tensed, her shoulders tightening in a reflex she hadn't meant to reveal. Adam leaned forward slightly, keeping his voice calm. "You're safe here." The words weren't soft or sentimental. They were confident, shaped by someone who meant what he said. Naeli let her back rest fully against the wall. "Safety feels strange," she admitted. "I don't know how to act inside it." "You get used to it," Adam said. His responses were always simple, but they carried weight, as if he had lived every one of them rather than spoken them as convenience. The stove warmed the room gradually. The mixture of heat and steady rainfall created a quiet rhythm inside the cabin that felt different from the silence they shared outdoors. It was more contained, more intimate, less exposed to the cold world around them. Naeli stretched her legs out, letting her muscles relax. For the first time that night, she wasn't actively bracing for the worst. She watched the fire, letting her eyelids lower slightly. Adam observed the change in her posture, the way she no longer sat at the ready, no longer kept her hands clenched near her sides. She was tired from days of travel, but exhaustion alone didn't create that shift. Comfort did. "You can sleep," Adam said. "I'll stay awake until the storm finishes." Naeli lifted her head at that. "You don't need to keep watch for me. I'm keeping watch because the weather can shake the door loose," he said. "And because 2 pairs of ears catch more than one." She considered this, then lowered her gaze. "All right." Adam settled against the opposite wall, leaving her space but staying close enough that she didn't feel isolated. The storm continued, but inside the cabin the tension slowly dissolved. Naeli lay on her side with her head against a folded blanket, her breathing even out, each inhale calmer than the one before. As she drifted into sleep, her hand relaxed around the ring for the first time since he found it. Adam remained awake, tending the fire and listening for shifts in the wind. He wasn't guarding her out of duty. He wasn't doing it out of obligation. He stayed awake because something inside him, something long dormant, told him her presence mattered. And for the first time in years, the cabin didn't feel like a place built for one person anymore. Morning broke with unexpected gentleness. The storm had passed during the final hours of the night, leaving a thin layer of moisture across the ground and a muted stillness over the ranch. Light pushed through the cabin window in soft bands, catching the faint steam rising from the damp earth outside. Naeli stirred first. Her eyes opened slowly, adjusting to the brightness that replaced last night's chaos. For a moment she didn't move, listening to the quiet, no shouting, no hoofbeats, no approaching footsteps, just a faint crackle of dying embers and the steady breath of a man sitting nearby. Adam sat in a chair he had pulled to the corner during the storm. His elbows rested loosely on his knees, head bowed slightly, as if he had spent most of the night thinking rather than sleeping. When she shifted, he lifted his eyes, offering a short nod that carried both concern and acknowledgement. "You slept," he said. "More than expected," she admitted, pushing herself upright. Her joints ached, but not in the way that came from fear or running. It was the ache of a body allowed to rest. Adam rose and opened the cabin door. Fresh air entered with a soft gust, carrying the sharp scent of wet soil. The ranch looked washed clean, mud clinging to the fence posts, puddles gathered near the trough, a sheen of water darkening the barn's exterior. He stepped outside to assess the damage. Nayeli followed, remaining a few paces behind. Her posture was different than the previous day, still alert but less defensive. The storm hadn't simply passed. It had pulled something out of her, leaving room for clearer thought. The south fence had sagged under the weight of wind and rain. Adam walked the length of it, testing each beam. "Storm weakened these posts," he said. "They'll need reinforcing." Nayeli knelt to examine the soil around the base. The ground was loose and waterlogged. "If it dries like this, the lower rails will drop." He glanced at her with appreciation for her assessment. "Then we'll fix them before sundown." She paused, not at the work, but at the word wheel. It held an assumption she wasn't sure how to interpret. She wasn't used to being included in someone else's plans unless her labor was being demanded or controlled. Here, the inclusion felt natural, unforced. Adam straightened and walked toward the barn to gather tools. Nayeli stood still for several seconds, absorbing the morning air. The storm had washed away more than dust. Her instinct to leave at first light was noticeably weaker. She caught up to Adam as he reached the tool crate. "I should tell you something," she said. He set down the hammer and looked at her without impatience. "I planned to leave after the storm." He didn't flinch. Most travelers move on when the weather clears. "But I'm not sure anymore," she said carefully. "Yesterday, when that rider came, I saw how quickly trouble can follow me. I didn't want that on your doorstep." Adam rested a hand on the crate. "Trouble doesn't scare me. Ambushes, fights, arguments. I've seen enough that your past doesn't change how I run this place." She looked down at her hands, noticing the faint marks from yesterday's repair work. "It's more than danger. Staying anywhere too long feels risky." "You decide what's right," Adam said. "Not what fear tells you." His words weren't soft, but they carried weight, not as persuasion, but as clarity. Nayeli walked a few steps away, scanning the open land. The sunlight glinted off a puddle near the trough, scattering reflections across the yard. She saw the trail she had followed days earlier, disappearing over the ridge. For the first time since arriving, the direction no longer felt like an escape route. When she returned to Adam, her posture had changed. "If you don't mind it," she said quietly, "I might stay longer." Adam didn't react visibly. He closed the lid of the tool crate and handed her a post driver. "Then help me set these rails before the ground dries wrong." The simplicity of his acceptance settled something deep inside her. No celebration, no dramatic reply, just a continuation of routine with her included in the space. They worked side by side for hours. Adam dug into the softened earth, resetting the base of each fence post while Nayeli stabilized the rails and secured the wire. Their coordination grew smoother with each task. Unspoken adjustments, intuitive timing, quiet focus. She noticed how he checked her position before lifting heavy pieces, making sure the weight wouldn't fall her way. He noticed how she anticipated which tools he needed, handing them over before he asked. By early afternoon, the fence line stood straight again. They stepped back to inspect it, sweat drying on their skin as warm sunlight pushed off the last traces of the storm. Nayeli wiped her forehead with the back of her wrist. "Looks solid," she said. Adam nodded. "Good work." There was no hesitation now when she met his eyes. No calculation, no doubt about his intentions. Only a calm acknowledgement that something had shifted between them, something subtle but undeniable. Back near the cabin, she untied the leather cord from her neck and held her mother's ring against the sunlight. The surface glimmered faintly, showing no residue from a storm. Without ceremony, she slipped it onto her finger. The gesture was small, but deliberate. Adam noticed, but didn't comment. He respected what wasn't his to interpret. Naeli stood still for a long moment, feeling the weight of the ring rest comfortably where it belonged. It didn't feel like a burden anymore. It didn't feel like a reminder of loss. It felt like a choice she had made. As the afternoon settled into a steady quiet, Adam carried the tools back to the barn. Naeli followed, slowing her pace as she realized something she hadn't fully admitted even to herself. She no longer felt like a visitor waiting for danger to return. She felt like someone who had begun to stay, because staying no longer frightened her the way leaving once did. The sun climbed slowly over Red Valley on the morning everything changed. The storm's moisture had begun to lift from the earth, leaving a faint shimmer across the soil. Birds moved cautiously along the fence posts, as if the ranch itself had settled into a calmer rhythm. Adam stepped out of the cabin with a sack of feed balanced against his shoulder, his movements steady and familiar. A man who lived by routine rarely altered his pace. But today his eyes moved with a quieter awareness, checking not for danger, but for someone. Naeli was behind the barn, gathering the blankets she had spread out to dry. Her hair fell in loose sections around her shoulders as she lifted each blanket with careful hands. She looked different now, not in appearance, but in the way she occupied space. She no longer hovered near walls or kept herself half-turned toward the nearest escape. She stood centered, grounded, present. Adam approached without hurrying. She heard his footsteps, but didn't tense, simply glanced toward him with a steady expression that signaled readiness rather than defense. "Fences held through the night," Adam said. "No more leaning." She nodded. "We fixed them well." Her use of "we" wasn't forced. It came naturally, as if she had always belonged in the work. Adam watched her fold the last blanket. "You planning to move on soon?" he asked, not to push her away, but because he wanted a clear answer without assumptions. Naeli held the blanket a moment longer before lowering it into the crate. "I thought about leaving. I thought about it every hour yesterday," she said. She stepped toward him, the dirt soft beneath her boots. "But every reason I had shifted." He didn't speak. He allowed her the space to continue. "When I arrived, I didn't trust anyone. I expected danger in every direction. I only meant to stay a night or two." She pressed her thumb against the ring on her finger. "But I woke today and realized something had changed. I wasn't thinking about where I would run next." Her voice stayed calm, free of hesitation. She wasn't confessing. She was stating what she had decided. "I want to remain here," she said, "if that's something you're willing to allow." Adam's breath left him slowly, the kind taken by someone who had lived too long without expecting companionship. "You don't need my permission," he said. "You choose for yourself. All I can say is, you're welcome." Her shoulders eased fully this time. It was the first moment he saw her unburdened by the instinct to brace for rejection. They spent the rest of the morning completing small tasks that had lingered since the storm. Adam hammered a loose board onto the chicken coop, while Naeli swept debris from a porch. Their movements ran parallel, separate tasks woven into a shared rhythm. When midday arrived, Adam took a break and leaned against the fence, watching the plains stretch into a distant haze. Naeli joined him, resting her hands on the top rail. For a long moment, they stood without speaking, the quiet more meaningful than any declaration. Then she asked, "What brought you here after your brother passed?" Adam rarely talked about that period of his life. But now, for once, the memory didn't feel like an exposed wound. "I needed distance," he said. "Too many eyes in town saw me as a reminder of what happened. Too many questions I didn't want to keep answering." Naeli turned her head slightly, waiting. "I came out here to start something that didn't depend on anyone else. Days were long, but they were mine." She absorbed his words with a thoughtful quiet. "And now?" He looked at her, not at the mountains, not at the land, but directly at her. "Now the days don't feel so empty." Her lips parted slightly, not in surprise, but in recognition. She had felt the same shift. Later, they repaired the latch on the barn door together. Nayeli held the metal plate in place while Adam drove the nails through. Their hands brushed once, brief but certain. Neither moved away. The work continued, and something between them grew more defined. No longer possibility, but intention. By late afternoon, they had finished every chore they had planned. The ranch felt organized in a way it hadn't before. Tools sorted, rails reinforced, stables secured, even the stacked logs arranged neatly by the cabin wall. It looked like a place shaped by two sets of hands, not one. As the sun lowered, Adam lit the lantern near the porch. Nayeli stepped beside him, her expression calm, her presence steady. She slipped the ring from her finger, held it in her palm for a moment, then slid it back on with a slow, deliberate movement. "This ring used to remind me of where I came from," she said. "Today it reminds me of where I chose to stay." Adam didn't try to respond with anything overly meaningful. He simply placed his hand over hers, applying gentle pressure that spoke for him. She accepted the gesture with a stillness that conveyed complete clarity. They walked toward the trough then, carrying 2 buckets between them to refill the water. The sky turned orange, casting long shadows that stretched across the yard. Their steps matched without effort. When they set the buckets down, Nayeli looked around the ranch. Every structure, every mark in the dust, every corner of the land illuminated by fading daylight. "This feels like a place I can build something," she said. Adam nodded. "Then build it with me." He didn't ask. He offered. Nayeli's eyes steadied, and she gave a single, certain nod. No fear, no hesitation. The evening closed with them sitting near the porch, watching the sun fall behind the ridge. Adam's arm rested behind her on the step. She leaned slightly into the warmth without needing to explain the significance of that choice. For the first time in years, Adam didn't feel alone on his land. For the first time since she fled her past, Nayeli felt rooted. The ranch no longer belonged to one wounded soul trying to survive the days. It belonged to 2 people building something solid, shared, and permanent. And with that, their story found its resolution. Clear, steady, and grounded in the simple truth that they had chosen each other.